Welcome to this webinar on the COVID-19 virus and also how this impacts on conflict. My name is Tanya Fent, I'm the CEO of Tukiso, and I'm joined here by Noreen.
I'm Noreen Khan, I think many of you know me. I work in social commentary on the labour market and social conflict. I used to be the CCMA director and now have my own consultancy.
Yeah, thanks, Noreen. Just as an intro, no doubt COVID-19 is changing the way we engage with each other. Since the President's speech on Sunday evening, more people are taking the imminent threat seriously. In such imminent crisis situations, we respond like there's a lion in the room. We fight or we flight. And this impacts on our very being. So it impacts on our physical control, our immune system, our temperament, emotions. Each person deals with this differently, but what is common is that we are all reacting. We can say don't panic, but the shopping malls show something different, that panic has already set in. No doubt this is going to escalate conflict and cause many disputes in the workplace and in our society. With this in mind, there are some material consequences of COVID-19, which is changing the nature of conflict as we see it. Firstly, human behavior is changing in response to the situation. Particularly elevated emotional responses, depending on your own personal circumstances and your personality type. Everyone is scared for their livelihood at this point, without exception. There are huge changes in our society already and the way people are responding and engaging. And there's also a curtailment of freedoms. We have a declared national state of disaster, and now we cannot be in a room with more than 100 people at a time. And all these aspects are likely to escalate. And as the virus spreads in our loved ones, and we feel the direct impact. So there's no doubt that we're going to start seeing people around us getting ill, and God forbid we see people around us start dying. And there is going to be enormous emotional and grief related to that. With this backdrop, Tukiso has identified 4 categories of types of disputes that we're likely to see, and we are seeing already starting to escalate. The first one is your individual conflicts, things specifically around leave, shifts, fixed term contracts, etc. Then we're also seeing a huge increase in the collective, we're likely to see a shift in the types of collective disputes we have. That being maybe increased number of retrenchments, pay issues, compliance with collective agreements, and obviously how the meetings take place between your management and unions. We're also likely to see a change and a shift, if not an increase in number of commercial type disputes, particularly around impossibility of performance issues, as well as matters around rentals, for example. And then finally, we've got a category, what we call novel disputes, where we're likely to see new types of disputes that we haven't seen in the past becoming quite common, particularly as forced changes in the way we work come upon us. So, Noreen, just bringing you in at this point, is how do you see this unfolding?
I mean, Tanya, I think firstly, everybody's saying it, we're living in unprecedented times. But I think that we all have to not panic, and we have to make sure that we try and address things in a calm and specific way. So I know you have the 4 areas that you've identified. I've tried to think about what is it going to happen. So we're going to see conflict in the workplace. How is that conflict going to arise? It's going to arise because you might have to force an employee who doesn't want to take leave. They might be going home to uncertainty, and there might be other reasons that they're going home. So in dealing with that, you need to deal with it in a very specific way. You need to be sensitive to the process. I think that in South African society, because we have a democracy, we've got a huge sense of self-entitlement and self-rights, unlike maybe in a place like China. And that also makes people more able to challenge and more able to question, etc. So we might have to look at what's going to happen in the legal principles, and do we actually have to resort to the law, or do we have to look at broader community issues and morality, and maybe just some basic fundamental sensibilities. We're going to have fights about meetings, about things that are going to happen around that. What is going to happen in a situation where you walk into a meeting, and this happened to me recently, where someone is actually visibly ill and they've got flu, and you can see that they've got flu. But that person, let's say the power imbalance comes out, as we always talk about in employment law, and that is that person is your boss, or your client, or they're paying you a huge amount of money to be there. How do you actually approach them? What do you say to them? Or is it your civic duty to say, listen, I'm sorry, you should be at home? Or do you call them out? Or do you just carry on and keep quiet and hope for the best when you get out and go home and shower and wash your hands and do all the things that we know we should be doing in that context? And I think that's a huge challenge.
Can we talk around that a little bit? Because
Yeah.
I think it's useful. Is that how do we have those difficult conversations? And we've seen it often where people, over the last week, I've had a lot of situations where I would normally hug somebody or shake their hand or engage, and South Africans are very physical people, we all know that. So how do we do that? And it is difficult, but I think the more we do it, especially if you're in a position of power to do it, the more it's going to become practice. That's the reality.
I totally agree. I mean, I think we have to take Ubuntu and imply it in a different way.
Yes, that's
because
interesting.
what I've been thinking of is two things. One is, like we all see people who wear a red badge or a red ribbon for HIV. Why can't we all start wearing a badge? So when you see somebody, because sometimes you see that person, you love that person so much. Like if I see you, Tanya, you might hug them or whatever it is, and you forget for that moment. All right.
Yeah.
So maybe having a badge or a color that we start assigning to coronavirus might help. And I've also got this idea about having sticks in the context of relation to that. What should you do in that context? But you also need to make sure that you as the leader take the position of power and actually are the person who deals with it appropriately. All right. So, I mean, just carrying on. Also, in sending someone home, and we were talking about,
let's talk about
the problem that people have. So firstly, you tell the employee they have to go home. But in sending them home, two things are going to happen. Firstly, they're going to worry about the economic implication of their job. Secondly, they're going to worry about what kind of leave are they on. Thirdly, you need to also be a caring employer and ask them, what is your home situation? Do you live with a vulnerable person? Have you been traveling in taxis? All the issues that go with that in relation to the process. How are you going to deal with that? And you need to actually try and have a process on that. Now, there's lots of discussion going on around how is leave dealt with.
Yeah.
I know that if I was sitting in government still, what I would be pushing very strongly. I mean, I think people are looking at the UIF, which obviously pays out leave, but the problem is that it only pays out after 14 days. But I think what is significant, and people haven't worked out, is that we all don't go to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which talks about your duty as an employer. But the other important thing that we must remember, now not being boring, but going to the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, which specifically stipulates that if there's an occupational health issue at work, sending a person off is not regarded as sick leave.
Yes.
Okay, so and in terms of OHS, it isn't a sick leave process. So we've got to start looking at maybe we apply it that way. Now, the problem that I have with that is that it's all fine for big employers
who can afford
to give people special leave or special sick leave or whatever it is. But what are we going to do for our medium and micro enterprises? It's going to really, really impact. And also on top of that, I mean, it's also fine for white collar workers.
Yes.
Because they can maybe just carry on working at home. But what about the people who are actually keeping our economy turning? And your
blue collar workers who really can't work from home and have a specific job that they're unable to.
Yeah.
One thing I know that when one looks at whether people can work at home or not, and I'm going to come back to the leave issue, is that what I've been saying is that the first question you should be asking people is, have they got the kinds of functions, or can their job be adapted to work from home? That's the first question. And if the answer is yes, then the second question is, at home, have they the means to do so? And is the environment conducive to do so? Because it's one thing to say, yes, go and work from home, but if they don't have Wi-Fi, a safe working space, is, for example, in the work we do, it's very confidential. You can't be working with lots of people around you. So you need to make sure that people have the means to do work as well. But that's, as you said, white collar workers. What do you do with blue collar workers?
And I think that's the huge challenge that we have. So, I mean, the things that you have to do in that situation is, firstly, I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking through, for those of you who understand the principle of essential services, and the essential services operates, and when I talk about essential services, hospitals, nurses, etc. But look at your business like an essential service. What is absolutely essential to keep your business functioning for your blue collar workers? And work out the golden thread of what that is. And then look at how you're going to get those workers to come into work. Look at them in the context of alternating shifts, having different people arriving at different times, having lunch hours taken differently, and have different sets of people so you can isolate them as much. I mean, a good example would be, there's a lot of medical professionals saying that the people who are on cruise ships who are actually kept on board actually made the situation worse, because you had 6,000 or 4,000 people exposed as opposed to a few little people in a small isolated pocket.
Yes.
If you'd taken them off and put them in a place. Likewise with your shift workers. So rather have staggered starting times and make sure people can't interact with each other. Obviously, that it goes without saying that close down canteens if possible. Make sure people observe personal hygiene. I mean, eating environment is really tricky. And then I'm very controversial on this. It's not a time where you worry about the environment. People must drink water out of sealed plastic bottles or those new cartons that you're getting.
Yes.
And don't worry about anything else, because you can't be sure about the
Or ask people to bring these sorts of bottles, these kind of reusable bottles that one gets. But so I just want to come back to the leave issue, because I know that's going to come up as a big issue, and seems to be the point of that's a vexed issue, is having that discussion with each individual. Of course, you need to be consistent in the application of leave. Whatever you decide as an employer, you need to be consistent. You can't be treating one group of people differently to another group of people simply because you could be up for discrimination issues. But in the consistent application, you need to accommodate, what you were saying is accommodate each individual's personal circumstances. So if somebody is working with an elderly person or living with somebody who's more vulnerable, of course you need to maybe accommodate and be more sensitive to that person. But I think there's been enough commentary on the law to say that people can take sick leave if they're ill and if they have a medical certificate.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you fall onto annual leave or unpaid leave. Alternatively, if employers are in a position to do so, to provide for special leave. That's what we're saying.
Absolutely.
Which would be a new category.
And of course, the issue is going to be an issue because most people have to self-isolate for the 14 days. And it's those 14 days that are not covered by the Unemployment Insurance Fund. And obviously after that, I'm guessing that I know the Unemployment Insurance Fund will have to cover you for sick leave, but that's the situation.
Yeah, but it is something they're currently looking at, I know, urgently. Is that right? Yeah,
as I understand it. Okay.
So let's just look at the other options. Is the whole issue around having those discussions. It's all good and well to say, oh, let's go and have that discussion with an employee, but certainly having those discussions are often very, very difficult because emotions are running high, both with individuals as well as with everybody in the room. Let's be honest, we're all feeling a little bit emotional and stressed at the moment.
Absolutely.
One option we've been discussing is bringing in a facilitator through an online chat system to facilitate such a discussion. Have you got any other suggestions?
So, I mean, I think that's a very good idea.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a very, very big believer that, and I'm a mediator, facilitator for life, okay? And I mean, bringing an individual, an independent third person is going to definitely help because it immediately tones down the emotion and people's behavior is demonstrated in a different way. And it ensures that there's control in the process and if the person sets the idea. So I think using online systems is very good and trying to do that. But I think that we also have to balance that with modern technology issues.
Yes.
And also around the nature of workforces in our country. So in some instances, for some people, that would be perfectly the norm. And by the way, I mean, I know for a fact in countries like Australia, they mediate and arbitrate over online, okay, given their long distances. But in other instances, for a person who's particularly vulnerable, and maybe there's a language barrier and all the issues, being online might be tricky. But then what my view would be is that you then actually have that person in, but then you apply a whole lot of specific criteria that you can do, social distancing, etc., and you explain that process going forward.
Yes.
But obviously, you'd have to get somebody to agree and consent to that, and you have to get through a process to do it.
Yeah.
And I do think bringing people in to try and facilitate the better discussions is a very, very good solution.
Yeah, those difficult discussions, if you are feeling that you need help, call upon Tukisa and ask for somebody to come in and assist with that discussion. And they do it over online, so there's minimal risk to everybody.
Exactly.
And like I said, everyone responds differently. You're getting people who are really panicking and getting sick as a result of the panic and stress that they're feeling.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the discrimination issue, because that was something I hadn't thought of, and when we were talking prior to the webinar you mentioned.
Yeah, so I feel very strongly about discrimination.
Yeah.
because I do a lot of work in it and I feel strongly about transformation. I do think that we need to be very, very cautious in South Africa around how we implement these issues. So certain people have said, oh, well, one of the solutions is to take people's temperature as you arrive at work. Now, I think that that's a hugely violating issue, and I think it is highly, highly controversial. But would it be problematic to ask people to wash their hands as they arrive at work? But it would be problematic if you said, if you've traveled in public transport, you've got to wash your hands. But I think if you ask everybody, and by the way, there's no exception here, and let's remember this is actually a class disease, and it's actually being brought in by more wealthy class people, I think that would be okay. But you need to be very, very careful around how you apply the principle. And it's the same way as saying, oh, well, you guys are white collar workers, and oh, well, we're all going home to work, but you guys must carry on coming to work because you are the workers who producing our widgets or whatever it is you're producing. You just cannot operate like that. So you have to be very, very careful as you implement a solution and deal with your employees that you don't actually indirectly cause a discriminatory issue, which would be, a problem. Yes. Obviously, everybody's still entitled to fair labor practices. I do think at this point there's going to be some suspension of law, and you have to just look at morality. But I think in that issue, specifically in South African society, it's going to be such a huge issue.
Yeah. So if you are going to do it, and obviously with the OSHA backdrop of OSHA, the Occupational Health and Safety, is employers have an obligation to create and ensure a safe work environment. So asking people to wash hands in this environment is a legitimate instruction.
Absolutely.
As long as it's applied to everyone consistently.
Yes, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is there anything else? A collective. I know we want to talk around the collective disputes that we're likely to see arise now.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're likely to see an increase in retrenchments and layoffs.
So I mean, a lot of businesses, by the nature that it might be contractors or things of that nature, are going to end up having to either put people onto, I hate to use the word, but 0-hour contracts, okay, or things of that nature, or they're going to have to try and deal with things in a different way. How are people going to deal with it? I mean, the reality is that you're going to see retrenchments. I think employers need to actually have a long, hard discussion around how they're going to address it. I think obvious things, the basic fundamentals that you normally do in a retrenchment, don't give increases. Look at how you're going to cut costs. Look at principles around that. Relook at your balance sheet. Maybe take that bonus pool that you've got on the balance sheet line and put that towards retrenchment packages, or try and limit it, or say to people, can you go off? I mean, I'm hoping, and I heard a little bit from what they discussed at NEDLAC yesterday, that they're going to use that there's a new system that's coming out in the context of similar to what was done in 2008, but it's slightly, you need to do it slightly different, which was a training layoff scheme, and hopefully that will actually help. But you won't be able to use training layoff in this situation because it still puts people together, but something of that nature.
But maybe online training mechanisms. But again, that caters for your white collar workers, not your blue collar workers necessarily. So there is those issues.
Yeah. So I mean, the other thing I thought of, Tanya, is that, I mean, people have got collective agreements. I know we talked about it offline earlier.
Yeah.
But I think that this would be a time where if you've got you would normally have an exit clause in your collective agreement. I think you have to trigger them. I mean, much like they did in the MEIBC when they needed to change the industry agreement when they had such difficult times, also in 2008, I think it was, or 2009, whatever it was.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, I think that you would actually be entitled to do that.
Yes, because these are unprecedented times, and this may be one of those times where one needs to renegotiate the circumstances. So that's a very valid point. The other thing I want to talk about is just around business continuity, how one can continue. You've spoken a little bit at the beginning around perhaps looking at the core businesses, but the reality is that one does worry. And businesses, especially in these difficult economic times, this couldn't come at a worse time, quite frankly.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, firstly, risk officers in big businesses it's their time.
Yes.
And they've got to actually implement their business continuity plans, which is, I mean, if there'd been a national disaster or if we'd had an earthquake, people would be working from home, and people wouldn't be traveling, etc., etc. So look into that, call upon your risk people to do that. I mean, just going to an employment issue, I've long been saying that many South Africans, in terms of risk, and South African businesses, let me say it carefully, don't identify employee issues as a risk. And it's actually a time to now relook at that and how that works in that context.
Good. And the strategic importance of HR generally, unfortunately, has not been highlighted over the last 15 years, I think. Not sufficiently, at least.
I mean, so one of the things that they are looking at doing is, and I think we're doing this, and I've been doing this for various people with my business partner, is to look at a risk assessment in your business. But the problem is that you can't have a generic risk assessment because every business is different.
And I think you can't anticipate any risk. No one could have anticipated this, quite frankly. Maybe we should move on to the questions,
Sure.
because I see a lot coming
I
up.
know, I see as well, I'm excited.
There's the first one. If we could just go up to those questions, I'm going to read them off the screen. Nkolisi has asked, is it advisable to convert all disciplinary proceedings from physical to video conferencing? If proceedings were to be conducted through video conferencing, does this make it susceptible to procedural challenges? In my view, as long as the fundamental principles of fairness in terms of Schedule 8 are honoured, no, it wouldn't. In other words, that there's sufficient notice, that the employee is given sufficient notice, given time to prepare, given a right to representation, to be heard in a language that they understand and conversant in. I personally don't think that hearing it through video conferencing is a problem.
And I think it's a common practice these days on many instances for witnesses. But one of the ways that you would probably best get around that is to actually get concessions and get agreement in writing that instead of having everybody in the room for everybody's health and safety, we've written it down, and therefore you sign an agreement that you're happy for the agreement to go that way.
Just so you know, Tokisa on its website, you can go and look for its COVID-19 guidelines in terms of meetings. If you are to have a meeting in person, we've actually put guidelines in place for our processes, but we've also put a guideline in place for conferencing and how to conduct that conferencing in a fair, appropriate manner. The other, just around conferencing as well, is that people are a little bit worried that they have to do, for example, submit written arguments, closing in writing. We've done it recently. We have done a couple of processes where people have done closing arguments through a voice recording.
Yeah, fantastic.
And use creativity. There is absolutely no reason we shouldn't be catering for people who are less comfortable writing, rather let them speak as they would normally in a hearing and submit it through.
And by the way, those are the great things, and let's see the positive about this invention or this process, that we're going to see different innovations coming out, and that's fantastic.
Yes, absolutely. Let's move to Shepard's question. How vulnerable are pregnant employees in the workplace during this period of COVID-19?
I mean, I would say that they're very vulnerable.
Yeah.
Okay, and I would say that you have to implement the similar principles that if somebody was pregnant and there was a risk at work, and you'd have to go through that process. So like if you were a miner and you were going underground and you were pregnant, you would not be allowed to go underground given the principles that go there. So I would say that you have to go and look at a process and try and deal with it, or remove them from a risky environment. Self-isolation in the workplace. I mean, the big challenge we've got with this modern thing of open plan offices. I mean, it would be much easier if people didn't have open plan offices.
Yes, it's
and air conditioning, of course. Okay.
Of course, the kind of contain without open windows. So everyone's saying open windows, quite right. I think we need to.
Yeah.
Now, a big problem is that's been raised is around schools are closing tomorrow. There's been a lot of calls to treat people kindly, particularly domestic workers who may need to go home to look after their own children. So if you do not have assistance at home, or you don't have nannies, and your children are at school, what do you do for your employees? I mean, how can an employee be expected to work when they're feeling stressed about their child at home? That's the bottom line. Any ideas? Noreen,
I think this is a very, very tough question. I mean, it's absolutely easy for white collar workers. And most employers are closing their offices and letting people go home and work from home. And if you and basically if you are more in the blue collar environment, you wouldn't be working at all, so you'd be there to look after your children. I mean, the usual thing would be, okay, we'll get everybody together and get different parents to babysit, but the whole point of closing the schools is that the children don't see each other.
Yeah, and there's the problem that children seem to be a conduit for COVID-19, so
exactly.
That's why we're closing the schools. Yeah. And often people depend on the grandparents to look after the kids, but they're the vulnerable
people, so it's very, very difficult.
I don't have a solution to it either.
It's very, very difficult. My view is that an employer needs to decide on some kind of policy process and look at how do you deal with it. I think that either you have to ask people to take special leave if you can afford it, or say people have to apply for annual leave. I'm very strongly of the view that even if we do that now, there may be subsequent regulations or issues dealt with by government and through the NEDLAC process, which will actually come to your rescue. I heard from listening to the executive director of NEDLAC this morning that the Minister of DTI is saying that they are looking at some kind of financial relief. I don't know what that is though.
Yeah, we don't have the details on that. We've got a question on potential liabilities in terms of the occupational health and safety. if employees become infected with COVID-19 by another employee during the course and scope of employment.
So my view on that is, my view that COVID-19 is only an occupational disease for healthcare workers. I think that that's going to become a very clear issue, because healthcare workers would be risked, just similar to if you get a needle stick fracture in HIV. So you apply that principle in relation to that. And then what I would suggest is that if somebody does get it at work, you do have a duty and to have a safe workplace, and you do have a duty to try and protect it. But I think that there's going to be a little bit of leniency in the context of that, because it's such an unusual situation. And I mean, we're in the old-fashioned version of a plague.
Yes.
And how could you hold people liable in that context?
Oh, I do think so. And also you don't know how, the fact is that it's very, very, very contagious.
Yeah.
And you can only do so much.
Exactly.
And there's as much of an obligation on each individual employee as there is on the employer.
Absolutely.
To ensure that they inform them that they were exposed or
Exactly.
etc. The employer's only got so much control.
Yeah, and what I've seen is that if you get hold of the NICD, so far they've been very, very good with their contact tracing.
They've been excellent, yeah. And I think the government's response generally has been excellent.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tanya and Noreen. I just quickly want to come in here. We've got a comment from a doctor who
Yes.
I think it's important we just quickly touch on
Yes.
this while we spoke about the pregnant woman. The doctor online, his comment is saying that there's no evidence yet in whether a pregnant woman is more vulnerable. They don't seem to be more vulnerable. The difficulty is that a pregnant woman is limited in taking the medication that someone who isn't pregnant can.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's
No,
a very,
exactly.
very valid point.
Yeah,
So
thanks,
it's the
yeah.
pregnant woman can't take certain medication,
Yeah.
which and that's where the risk comes in.
Yeah.
So we got another question here is around suspected illness, self-quarantine option. Sorry, I've lost that question. It was there. How do you, yes.
Payment of employees? Oh, no, yeah.
Self-quarantine while waiting for test results is a special annual or unpaid leave.
Okay, so I think we've sort of covered it already,
Yes.
but we can go through it again. Or should we not? Okay.
I think let's just do it because it's so
Yeah,
important.
it's so important.
Unless somebody's actually ill with
Yeah.
a medical practitioner's valid medical practitioner certificate, it cannot be sick leave.
Yeah.
That's my view.
Yeah.
In terms of the law. The employers would be able to draw on annual leave and they've got an obligation, if somebody has been exposed, to create a safe work environment and ask people to stay at home.
Yes, and then in terms of occupational health and safety, if you're asking somebody in that way and it's a legitimate instruction at work, the BCA says that doesn't count as sick leave.
Yes.
Okay.
Which implies it must count as
annual leave. Or it must count, I'm actually going to check exactly what the words are, or it must be as if you a suspension of a different kind. Okay, I don't want to use that word, but
paid
paid suspension, a precautionary suspension from work.
Yeah, but the law doesn't refer to it as that. And that's the problem. There seems to be a little bit of a absence of clarity
if you balance the liability and your duty in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Section 8, I think it is, or 6, you've got an obligation to create a safe working environment. So you've got to send the employee home. So therefore, it's a legitimate instruction to go. Okay, it's not
But employers can also compel people to take annual leave.
Absolutely.
So there is that. However, if, in my view, and this is more a moral principle issue,
absolutely.
is that if an employer is in a position to offer special leave, do so.
Yeah.
Be kind.
And try and show caring. Bearing in mind that, as I said already, that the 14 days of being off will kick in just as you get the outcome of your test or your quarantine. And or not just your test, but your quarantine. And basically then the UIF claim will be able to kick in. So maybe if you're funding that, if you can afford to, and I accept that some employers can't afford to.
Yeah. Okay, we got a question from Kristen around alternative to retrenchment. Can a company suspend without pay until they're able to continue working business operations? That way they can still have a job once this blows over. So could they lay people off, in other words?
Well, you can try and do that and say to people you just can't afford to pay them, and try and see what you could do. I think that you could also try and see if you could click into the UIF in that context, or a short process. I mentioned earlier the training layoff that we used in 2008. I know the Department of Labour and Employment are working with the CCMA to do something else similar. And what that does is that it allows you to have what I call a pay holiday, and it assists you with your on your balance sheet. So you won't have to necessarily pay your employees. You might have to still pay pension, UIF payments and things of that nature, but only a small amount. and then you let the employees go off. So at that time we put people on training, and as you said, it's not really a good thing for blue collar workers, but maybe there would be other solutions in that context. And I'm going to guess, and please it's a guess, that that's what we're going to see coming out of the DTI shortly.
Yeah, I think so too. There's been a question about the creches and schools closing. I think we've dealt with that one in respect. So if we can go to question number 7. Facilitation requires a group gathering of more than these are not allowed in South Africa. So you could have a group gathering of over 100 people. And we often you don't have the opportunity to use technology in that environment. What do you do? If you need to do a 189 process? I think you just have to hold smaller consultation sessions. That's the answer.
So what you have to do, I mean, let me give you an easy example. You would break employees down into certain sections. Like, for example, if you had all those 100 people, maybe you could identify common threads with them. Like, remember I talked earlier about the golden thread. So let's say of those 500 employees, some worked in one area and some in another, then you could maybe just run the facilitation and limiting them to 99 people plus you, and try and do it that way. I mean, because you have to still proceed with that process. You can't stop it. Or you might have to get special permission. And the other thing, of course, as I've said, make sure everybody's talking to each other at 1 meter or 1.5 meters away from each other.
And one of the questions somebody asked me was, how do you take an attendance register? You're moving a paper around and effectively touching, and that could be risky as well. The one option we've put in place is to, firstly, the facilitator takes the names down, but if the group's quite large, why not just take a photo of the room and then fill it out afterwards? The photo is enough evidence. Be innovative. There are solutions to these things. Photos work, and it is evidence that certain people in the room, and you can then fill out the attendance register afterwards based on the photograph.
As long as you know the names. And
yes, of course. So most employers, I would hope, would be able to identify their own employees. Would you recommend a workplace forum to be formed for this particular virus, or leave this to the occupational health and safety committees or management to inform the direction to minimize possible discrimination?
I think that you need to have a very specific committee, not just your OHS people. You need to have a much bigger process, and you need to also make sure you have all levels of work, the workforce represented there, so that they can understand what the different implications are. I would not say that the OHS committee, they've certainly got a role to play, there's no debate, but I would have a COVID-19 response committee available in your workplace.
And make sure that you've got organised labour there as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would think that a director of some sort, if not the CEO of the organisation, should be heading that.
Because it's such a critical issue.
It's critical. You need decision makers in there, you need organised labour there. So as another question is, as an alternative to retrenchment, can a company suspend without pay? I think that's the one we worked of. Can you put lay people off without pay for a period of time until it blows over?
Look, I've seen it done in South Africa by agreement and process, but I mean, it's a very unusual step. I mean, and we already got real challenges in our society. So, I mean, it's going to be very tricky, but I think you're going to see employers doing exactly
And
that.
let's hope the UIF is able to step in and fill that gap in terms of wage, offering at least some form of income for those employees that are affected, and actually provides for that exact step. Because I think that is one option. The other option,
it is an operational requirement. I mean, it's not like a retrenchment. It would be in terms of the operational requirement definition. And I think you could probably claim UIF based on that.
Yeah, you could, but only after 14 days at the moment. That's where the problem lies in. But you could be creative. You could say to employees, look here, our income has dropped dramatically as a business. Maybe what we could do is reduce people's pay by 50% for the next 2 months. And then say that it's not that they're not going to see that income. Once there's recovery, that will be paid. But at least people are getting something, and jobs are saved to some extent. Think creatively, and I think employees understand the crisis. And I think hopefully people are going to become creative around solutions. Yes, one is a failure to disclose a positive test.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that would be a dismissible offence. Okay, I mean, and by the way, I would actually go so far as to say, given what we know, that it could ultimately be seen as criminal.
Yes.
Because people can die from it, and we know. And even if they don't do that, the real issue is that, I don't know if people know, but even if you recover from the disease, you have lung damage for the rest of your life. So
really?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, I didn't know that, and that's quite serious. Okay, answer these in order. Let's go to the next one. Is due to operational requirements, employers may require employees to report for duty. Employees may refuse to report due to unsafe working environments as a result of the virus. would this result in an increase in constructive dismissal claims?
I mean, I'm sure it would, and I think people would get into a difficult situation. I would personally think that it's unlikely that a fair dismissal would be found in those circumstances. You have a right as an employee to refuse. I mean, you can't just be instructed. I mean, it's just like saying, please go and kill somebody. But the reality is that an employer also has a right to ask you to be there and give you a legitimate instruction, but the employer has to do everything in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act to make sure that they create a safe working environment.
So in other words, unless there's a direct threat to that employee, they can't refuse. Just because they're scared, they can't not come to work.
Exactly.
It has to be reasonable,
and you have to have a reasonable.
And they must have at least informed the employer, said, "I'm unhappy for this reason," given the employer an opportunity to respond
and to say what they've done to try and
mitigate. They can't just say, the employer says, "Come to work." Oh, I'm scared. I don't want to go to work, and suddenly say, "Well, I'm resigning and I'm going to complain." You're not going to win a constructive dismissal on that basis.
Well, that would be my view. Okay.
Well, that certainly
because
would be
why
my
did they
view.
make the environment so intolerable?
Yes. On what basis? And you need to give an employer an opportunity to respond and correct the situation. So the next question is...
we've dealt with 189, okay.
I've dealt with 189. Sorry, we're just trying to... There are so many questions coming through, so bear with us.
Okay, we've answered that
I think we've answered that number 14 there.
15.
15. If it's confirmed illness, is it sick leave? Yes. So if somebody actually gets ill,
absolutely.
they take sick leave under the normal sick leave provisions. Can a company use sick leave for employees who have been sent home by the company as precaution but can't work from home? Therefore, once sick leave exhausted, the company make determination of special leave. That comes back to my original point. Unless somebody is actually ill with a medical practitioner's medical certificate, it couldn't be sick leave. I want to say something around being a medical practitioner sick leave. It's something we've done, is that there has been a caution to say, if you do get sick, don't go to a medical practitioner unnecessarily because they are overwhelmed. We don't want to make our medical practitioners sick either. So only go to them if you're really very ill. So you may want to put in an extraordinary new clause in your sick leave provision to say that you just need to inform the employer you're sick. And you must be sick. You mustn't lie about it, obviously, if you're ill. But you don't actually need the employer dispenses with the need for of a medical
for now,
for a sick note for now because of the circumstances. So we've put that in place, and it's something to consider.
Yeah. So the next question is about employees bringing their kids to work. I mean, absolutely, the answer would be no. Okay. Because the whole point of closing the schools is defeated by that process. And I know that's a very tricky situation, and I know that's very depressing, but that's the facts. Okay?
That's the facts, is that the answer should be absolutely and categorically no. We're going to put everyone...
Normally you would be yes.
Normally my answer would also be yes. Yeah. Kids should be allowed in the workplace, and it should encourage children to see where their parents work, etc.
And the other one is about somebody sitting next to... I think somebody's asked, can an employee refuse to sit... Am I looking in the wrong place?
No,
next to somebody. Okay.
Let's look at that one. I think we've answered number 9, the next question. How can one claim UIF without having to go into the public centre where people who are sick could be trying to claim? This is we've got a solution to this one.
Yeah.
Is that what I think employers should be doing, be compelled to do, in fact, is help employees to claim UIF online. The UIF has an excellent site that is very accessible and easy to use, and employers can actually lodge the claim online on behalf of employees, and then employees are not required to stand in the line. Very simple solution. Please go to their site and look at this. Quite frankly, this should be a requirement anyway for employees who are claiming maternity benefits or who have been retrenched and claiming UIF benefits.
Sorry, if I can come in here,
Yes.
Tanya, when we had a chat with the UIF, they actually encouraged employers to involve them in an at an early stage rather, of the discussions. It need not be at the end when a decision's been made. Involve them in the beginning in the process.
So the UIF through the Department of Labour inspectors will come out and help you at your workplace. I don't know if they'll do that now, but they'll certainly give you advice on the line. Okay.
Yes, they'll give you advice online, absolutely. When we spoke to UIF the other day, they were very helpful and said, please call us if you are intending, or there's a likelihood that retrenchments are going to happen, even before a decision is made. Bring them in so that they can communicate on how best to assist employees to make the necessary claims.
And then normally if it's a big amount of people, they'll actually come and process the
right
papers right at there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's very quick and people shouldn't be standing in queues, especially if you're an employer with means and access to internet and computers. Yeah. Sure. So let's take the last couple of questions. Is Can an employee refuse to sit next to someone who they suspect has travelled to a high-risk country?
Okay, so this goes to my discrimination issue.
Yes.
So my quick answer is yes, okay? But my slow answer is you need to be very, very careful how you implement this, and you need to have a process in dealing with it, because it can lead to a whole lot of other issues that happen in the workplace and a whole lot of other discriminatory issues. And there's so many challenges in South African workplaces which can link issues of race, gender, or sexual orientation, and that, and people can use it as an excuse. So if there's a real genuine and if you've got a reasonable a reasonable belief that that person has traveled there and you feel at risk, I think there's nothing wrong, but you'll have to follow a process. You must go to HR, you must tell the person and deal with the issue. And firstly, by the way, you should be asking your employer to send them home before you're refusing to sit next to them.
Yeah, okay. I think that's right. Now, another question is, are there any fears of CCMA being unable to hear disputes in light of the courts also limiting the number of cases referred? Are there ways to refer disputes to TOKISA? Just to say, there has been a directive coming out from the courts indicating limiting access to courts, directing that people refer cases online, and also they've certainly made provision for postponements of matters, and judges will be working from home when they're not hearing urgent matters. So the courts have already responded. I'm not sure if the CCMA has responded. I have seen a circular going around encouraging their officers to apply appropriate means, but they weren't specific. And I have no doubt the CCMA will act accordingly. But certainly one option is, if you are concerned about going to the CCMA, TOKISA is a private and accredited private agency in terms of Section 127 of the Labour Relations Act, and therefore we can receive referrals. The same types of disputes you refer to the CCMA, you can come to TOKISA, and TOKISA has guidelines around dealing with processes in an appropriate way in light of the virus. And secondly, we've also got conferencing facilities we'll make available. So please do call our officers, and we're happy to help you. Just one thing is, we need the consent of both parties to refer the case, and we can take you through the requirements of that. So I hope that answers that question. Sure, we got more questions coming through. I thought we were at the end of it, but I'm going to take a couple more and then we'll wrap up. Is, what can failure to disclose that you tested positive to the virus mean for an employee? Well, like we said, I think we've resolved.
I think that failure to disclose would be seen as a very serious offence. I think it would be a disciplinary action. I would immediately suspend the person and I would take them through a process. And in addition to that, I think that it could go to almost a criminal issue, because we all know that there are consequences. And I mean, even the president's declared a national disaster.
Yeah, okay. Next question, it's an anonymous person, is, what are the steps to follow if the environment you work at is health, hygiene hazard? Officers were last cleaned on the 28th of February due to cost cutting. What can we do as employees?
Okay, so in this situation, firstly, I think that you should probably raise a grievance to use the internal procedures in relation to that. But in addition to that, you can phone the Department of Labour. They have special occupational health and safety inspectors, and you can raise a concern, and there are different regulations and processes, and they should come around on that. And I would say, in the circumstances of what we're dealing with now, the failure to clean on its own is actually going to be seen as a hazard, and therefore there's a process on that.
But the first thing to do is maybe just speak to your employer and raise your concerns. It's often
start with just basics, okay?
Yeah, start with basics. Communicate this to HR or to your manager and say this is a concern. And you'd be surprised, maybe they just didn't realize something.
And can I say something else, okay? Guys, we're talking about being the best South African you can be right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe my suggestion is that employees actually chip in and actually clean up for themselves, because you want to, at the end of this, have a job, okay?
Yes, exactly.
And you actually want the employer to be able to survive, and you've said the question says it's because of cost cutting.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think we're going to wrap it up there.
Yeah,
it's been a longer webinar than we normally do because of all the questions. Couple of things is, first and foremost, this webinar will be on our website by tomorrow, within 24 hours. So if you want to share or wish to share it with any of your colleagues or anybody else, you're welcome to direct them to our website to access it. The second thing is that we do have webinars on our commonly have webinars on a regular basis. We do have some webinars up that are coming up as from next week. We will be changing the webinars most likely in response to this unprecedented circumstances. So please look out on our website for further webinars we'll be doing on very specific topics and it's very likely to be related to this one we've dealt with today. So thanks to Noreen. And,
thanks, Tanya.
please do call us if you've got any further questions. There are some other questions coming through. We will be responding to those questions offline.
Yeah, and I would think it's a good idea for people to come and refer the cases to Tukiso.
Yeah, thank you. And it's just to say that we are expecting a lot more disputes. Talk to us if you are, and we've got innovative ways, be them commercial or labor disputes. We've got ways of getting around the challenges we have today, because that's what we are. We're innovative as Tukiso, and we are independent. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.